People who've attended the funeral of somebody who died in criminal very frowned upon circumstances, that is shot while robbing a store. What was it like? A friend of mine had a psychotic break. He tried to kill himself, and his GF walked in on him right before he did it. So he tried to kill her too. She fought him off, and he then ran out the house and killed himself in the parking lot. His parents quietly collected his remains. There was no funeral service. There was no burial. There was no mass or dinner or anything. He just ceased to be. That sounds like truly traumatic experience for all involved. If he was a good guy when his mental illness was managed, the whole situation just sounds incredibly sad. What a shame. A girl I went to high school with died under mysterious circumstances. Nobody knew if her overdose on antipsychotics was an accident or on purpose. At her funeral, which almost nobody went to, her parents used the opportunity to merely promote their church group, which was putting on a play in the next few days. That's all they talked about for the entire service. I'm still not sure of what happened, but it was pretty obvious her parents had checked out of her life a long time ago. Frick, that's depressing. My father murdered my mother when I was 4. He committed suicide when I was in my early 20s. By law I had to pick up his body. I had him cremated and stuff into a wooden box. I was dating my boyfriend, now husband, and made him do the drive from Palm Springs to Arizona at night. That drive is the worst drive in the world. A whole lot of nothing for miles and miles. We drove off the road to some random spot and dug a 2-foot hole. I dumped the box in and set it on fire. It was the worst funeral in the worst place for a worst person I know. Kid I knew in high school OD'd on H a few days after getting out of rehab. He was a pretty crappy dude who stole from everyone, burned people whenever possible, and acted like being a junkie was something cool. I went to his funeral with one other friend, and there were maybe 10 family members there. It was really sad that he had been such a shitheel at age 17 that so few cared to attend. Knew a guy that was just an utter tool. He and his brother beat and robbed someone they didn't like, stole the guy's car, got into a high-speed chase with cops on crappy back roads, went off the road, the driver died on impact, brother just broke several bones. Everyone was very upset. They kinda just glossed over the fact that he caused his own death while running from police. I'm not glad he's dead, but I couldn't see him doing much with his life though after that incident. I had a cousin, didn't know her well, who was addicted to drugs. She got into a fight with her sick drug dealer boyfriend. He tried to drive off. She tried to stop him. He then ran her over and it killed her. The funeral was super awkward because they insisted it be open casket and you could tell that there had been a lot of reassembly. It just didn't look like her, which made everything more sad. Side note, the funeral home was in a weird blind curve and the parking lot was across the street. My mother went outside to smoke. She was gone for like 30 minutes, so I went out to check on her. She was talking to my great aunt, victim's grandmother. Mom said, "Her what's up?" I replied jokingly with, "Just came to make sure you hadn't been run over." I immediately realized what I said, and sadly so did everyone else around. I'm awkward around death. I went to a funeral for a guy I had never met. He was related to someone who I was only related to by marriage. He committed suicide by cop, which means he was running from a cop and pulled an unloaded weapon, pointed it at the cop, forcing the cop to shoot and kill him. Shot 7 times and it was a freaking open casket. This guy had to be sewed back together. What made me feel the most was the cop showed up in uniform to give his condolences and the family couldn't blame him at all. He sat through the entire service in the back row about to cry, then just left. I could tell he was devastated. That's frankly tragic. Of course the cop would be wishing if it could somehow have gone another way. Now he has to live with it. Not his fault. Just so sad. When I was in high school, a guy named Sammy got drunk or something, stole a car, and he and his friend got into a high-speed car chase on the freeway. They hit a pillar on an overpass and blew the car to pieces, both dying on impact. This was not in Sammy's character. He was not a drunk or a criminal type at all. Not tame, but not out there either. The funeral was devastating. Most of us were in disbelief. Not just that they had both died in such a dramatic and unimaginable way, but that it was, well, Sammy. I remember the sense of utter confusion mixed with overwhelming grief. My best friend from preschool dead on H. It was probably the 6th or 7th awkward H wake I've attended. The family shoulder, Wilder, Colders while all the deceased's friends dope nod in the gallery. They're always the same sort of affair. What really set this one apart was his little brother was stealing money and phones out of people's bags when they went up to the coffin. He got caught, ran out and then got in a fight with the cop directing traffic outside the funeral home. He got arrested, booked and released, then nearly dead in the parking lot. In my class of about 40 people at rehab, about 20 were dead within 18 months. My first year in the halfway house I had 7 roommates die. It's freaking rough, man. My childhood friend was murdered by his drug addict dad. Dad got away with it by claiming self-defense and talked to the local newspapers saying his son was insane. He wasn't. So not only was my friend murdered, his name got dragged through the mud after he died. My family wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. I recently had a friend who was murdered by her husband along with their young daughters. Both sides of the families agreed to include him in the memorial service. It was weird, but the pastor leading the service did a good job addressing the crime, but said we weren't gathered to judge his crime, only remember and celebrate their lives. Quiet and awkward. A family member of mine's ex. His mom divorced the guy decades ago. Stepdad, whom the community regarded as a stand-up guy, member of the booster club, all that crap that can make you look like a decent person to the general public, was killed. To make a long story short, and from what I understand, some teenage prostitutes that he hired previously and knew, and their pimp broke into his house at night, blew his brains out while he was still laying in bed, and stole his sports car. Local people were shocked, but the evidence after his death was clear enough for everybody to realize that the guy was a huge piece of crap, which made those in my family who, for decades already knew he was garbage, feel a bit of satisfaction. He was a physically and emotionally abusive pose to those living under his roof for decades, so for a lot of people who actually knew him, the funeral seemed more of like a told you so moment. My mom and I lived together with a psychopath. He hit my mom. He hit me, molested me while my mom was at work. Before we came into the picture, he sometimes hit his 2 sons so much that they couldn't go to school because of the bruises, etc. Years later we discovered that he had raped his ex-wife with a gun against her head. The threatened a friend of his because his friend told him to calm down, stop terrorizing people. Just walked into his office with a gun and told him to shut up or else he would kill his family. About 10-11 years after we got away, this butthole died. I drove about 800 kilometers to be at his funeral. I just had to make sure he was dead. And, you know, to tell him I won. Was supposed to be open casket, but he died of an heart attack, and his dogs started eating him after a while. He wanted to be cremated and have his ashes spread on a mountain, but his sons decided to spread his ashes in the sewers instead. A good friend about 2 years ago used to play D&D with him and his brother every Sunday and Wednesday. He one night died from losing control while racing. Hit the railing at what was estimated 120/130 mph. The funeral was just pure sadness. The other 7 members of the dungeon were there. I personally knew him since the 3rd grade, the others around the same time as we attended the same school or lived near each other. It was like losing a family member. During the final moments before lowering the casket, we all placed our 3D printed and painted character where the roses are usually placed. We retired that story. Everyone lost the sensation to play. It just didn't feel the same. We only started backplay a couple months ago. Dang. These details made me tear up. You must be the DM. It was a suicide of a sorority sister, Southern Baptist, who was barely 21 years. No one, I mean no one, spoke of her death. No one. I read the obituary and showed up, but nobody would tell me how she died. Standing in the midst of over 200 people, and I had no idea what put her in the casket. It was days before I found out from someone out of state. It felt very weird and cold. This is a stark contrast to a friend of mine in high school 3 years earlier. Everyone knew, spoke of it. We stood there in front of his body and discussed what we could have done differently, trying to not let each other feel utterly responsible for not seeing he was in such pain. It was ugly and emotional, but felt healthier. Grief and bereavement drives people to a very intimate response, no matter how they present. Then there's the cultural and social filters. Think I'm more candid than some people are comfortable with when faced with the reality of death. A good lesson someone once taught me is that if a reason for unexpected death isn't given, it's generally suicide and best not to ask. I had an uncle who was involved in drug trafficking. I know that he was involved in murders. He was eventually arrested and died in jail due to complications with his heart. I was only 10 when he died, but I remember people being really sad at his funeral. His mom, my grandmother, didn't believe that he committed any of the murders that he was convicted of. Most of the family has positive opinions of him. The general belief is that he got involved with the wrong crowd and made bad decisions, but wasn't a bad guy. It was a pretty traditional and sad Catholic funeral. I do think it was weird looking back on it now. Denial is very strong. A teacher of mine committed suicide. None of that was ever mentioned and most people outside of his friends and family there didn't know. I found out through a mutual friend. He was very young and none of the students noticed a thing. Teaching was his second job. His career was starting to take off. He was always so kind and caring, and going the extra mile for the students. My last memory of him was that he stayed back late in school to help me when he really didn't have to, and was speed critiquing my work. And I was trying to take down notes as fast as I could as the school was shutting down for the day. We were all devastated. Not a single dry eye. I think it's better that they didn't know and keep the good memories. Family member that committed suicide in a horrific manner. Not your usual pill OD. Very frowned upon in my culture. Services took place outside. Went around the very small town the next day with my aunts. They met somebody they knew. Everybody knew the story, of course. Those people insisted on telling us that our family member was not going to heaven. My aunt got heated up and started quoting Bible verses. Sounds funny in retrospect. It's pretty sad how people can be just so stupid. Stupid to get my aunt any help that was clearly schizo. Stupid to just gossip about somebody's suicide and stupid to judge. And stupid to even bother to change people's minds. Maybe similar. But when I was 19 my 19-year-old cousin committed suicide. We were very close, born 3 months apart, and used to party together. I had no idea he would do it. The funeral was tragic. It was the most depressing funeral I had ever been to. There was no fond memories, no consoling, nothing, pure sadness. I was only 4 years old at the time. It happened in 2000. And it was my grandma's funeral. She had been a clerk at a 7/11 in Kansas City when 2 masked men came in and shot her multiple times and walked out without taking a single thing. I don't remember actually receiving the news. However, I do remember quite well the funeral. It was fairly large because my grandma had a big family and since it was big news at the time other people, I assume strangers who heard what happened, came as well. There was crying. But not as much as other funerals I've been to. Thinking about it now I think that everyone was still in major shock about what happened. One of the very few memories of my grandma was my mom lifting me up so I could see her and lay a rose across her chest in her casket and man oh man did she look absolutely beautiful. I wish I could have just one conversation with her. Just one. I hope one day they will find who did it so I can forgive them. However, 17 years later and we're still waiting for any answer we can find. Sounds like a gang initiation thing. So tragically sad. I had a friend that was murdered in a not too dissimilar way. A good friend of mine drove drunk and got in a wreck that not only killed him, but a 16-year-old young man in the other car. His funeral was like any other. We comforted each other, shared stories about him, cried together. I don't remember anyone talking about the accident. That poor 16-year-old. A girl who I cared a lot about was murdered while working as a private dancer. It was a terribly sad funeral, as she was a lot of other things to people too. A daughter, a sister, a friend. Another dancer from where she worked at the spa came and placed a rose on her coffin. Nobody knew her like that girl did. No one knew who the girl with the rose was, or what she knew. The murder was never solved, nor even investigated beyond a simple crime scene sweep. She looked like Snow White, sleeping in her coffin. Her eyes looked like black spiders, with powder blue eyeshadow. It really wrecked my heart. This upset me far more than the rest in this thread. A family member of mine attended the funeral of the son of an acquaintance, not friend. The son killed someone, rival gang member, ran away when the police showed up. Shot a police dog, then was killed by the police. It was big news here, mostly about the dog. Apparently, at the funeral, everyone was angry at the police for shooting and killing him. Someone said they should have shot him in the leg or something. A few years ago, a friend of mine that I knew for years was stabbed to death by somebody he was trying to rob. The worst part about it is the police left his body in the middle of a busy street for a couple of hours, or what felt like it, before they called somebody to take it away. Some people believed it was in part because he was a known gang member. The funeral was like any other I've been to, except in my family and where I'm from everybody wears red clothing of some sort. Another one that comes to mind is my father. He was a lifelong crack addict and at the time he stayed sober for the most part. Anyways, long story short, he was high and got robbed. Jumped through a glass door, cut his wrist and bled to death. He tried banging on a neighbor's door but because of the area they were scared to answer, so he passed out and bled to death over several hours. His funeral was one of the biggest I've ever been to and lasted hours. My sympathies. My mom committed suicide. All the family friends who hadn't given her a passing thought in years or decades just materialized out of the woodwork. I could just feel them feeding on the drama and the horror of it all. It felt like a circus. It felt like she was some sort of sideshow freak and it was exciting for them to speculate on how it had happened, what sent her over the edge. All the cooing and fake sympathy for us poor kids. I bitterly wished it could have been only those that truly gave a dang about her who would have experienced grief alongside me instead of treating it like this month's great entertainment. Not sure if this is the same thing, but I had a boyfriend in my early 20s who committed. I was really surprised that at his funeral it appeared that either no one really knew him like I did, including his family, or they were all entirely being full of crap. No one mentioned his grossly mismanaged mental health issues. No one brought up his numerous breakdowns. Trips to the which I personally took him at least half a dozen times myself. No one seemed to have a clue about his rampant drug abuse. In fact, his mother somehow managed to completely convince herself that he had overdosed on vitamins, claiming that he had body dysmorphia and he had overdosed on creatine pills. I couldn't tell if she was lying to me, lying to herself, or genuinely did not know, and I was not going to be the one to shake her back into reality. If it was my son, I'd want to imagine he OD'd on vitamins too, I guess. Though, I don't think I'd be deluded enough to convince myself of that. Basically, no one really talked about him. They appeared to be talking about someone else. Someone who was a dedicated student and talented artist who had this really successful life ahead of him that was cut short by the evil vitamin industry. It felt really fake and bullshitty, and Chris hated bulls. I could feel him rolling in his grave. I wanted to do him the solid of getting up in front of everyone and telling them all to shove their sappy "he was so great, let's ignore who he really was" bulls up their asses. He would have given a standing ovation. He would have been smiling down on me as I told them all what deluded pieces of crap they are sitting around talking about him when they obviously didn't give either a crap about how he was actually doing, or they really didn't know him at all and should frick the right off. But I didn't. I was 21 and extremely upset and didn't even know what to do with myself, so I just kept my mouth shut. But yay, it was like being at a funeral for a complete stranger. It wasn't even about him. I'm sorry for your loss and the lack of honest support you received from his relatives. You can be proud of yourself that you were such a loving person by his side who apparently was the only one who took him seriously enough. My first decent boyfriend died at 20 in a single vehicle drunk driving accident. No one talked about how it was a preventable death or that he'd put a lot of lives in danger by being on the road. At the time I thought it was weird that we all acted like it was pure tragedy, but I didn't want to be the first to say it. I like to think that if I'm ever in another situation like that, I'll make sure it's addressed. Something about how all the pain and grief could have been prevented isn't disrespectful to the dead, but it doesn't ignore essential information. My great-grandmother's younger sister, about the age of my grandmother, was sent to a psychiatric hospital for attempting to murder my grandfather's brother with a broken bottle when she was in her late 40s. That was the final straw after an arson attempt, mailing threatening racist letters to neighbors, calling the police to report random people she didn't like, saying they tried to break in, etc. Family tried to visit her fairly often, but she was always mean. When cancer took her niece's husband, My maternal grandfather, whose brother she tried to stab. She left dozens of nasty messages. She lived there angry and mean, with less and less people visiting her for 25 years until she died angry. Her funeral was attended by so few people that someone had to go outside to try to find an extra pallbearer. The priest, who knew her, basically said that hopefully she'll find the peace of mind she never had in life. She wasn't buried on the family plot, not even the same cemetery, and no one visits her. My sister was killed not long ago by a gang member who hadn't been out of prison for no more than a month and had a long rap sheet. He swerved into her, killing himself, passengers in his car, and my sister. My sister's boyfriend is the only survivor. His life is ruined. He might never walk again, and the woman he wanted to marry and have kids with was killed. The police strongly suspect the driver was under the influence of drugs. I never went to the guy's funeral, but I did see pictures of it and comments on Facebook. They are smiling and talking about how he wasn't perfect, but he was a good guy and changing his life around. He was a piece of crap criminal. Obviously prison didn't change him for the better. He was driving high and killed my sister, who truly was an angel. She truly wanted to make the world a better place. She volunteered but only talked about it to invite others to help. When you talk to her, she concentrated solely on you like you were the most important person in the room. He killed 3 other people and ruined a life, but he got a beautiful funeral where people said amazing things about him. Non-violent offenders. Sorry man. My friend's kid was killed by 2 cholas at a skate park because they needed to prove their worth to the gang they were in. One was a minor and the other 18. They had the book thrown at them and might get the death penalty in the end. Some of these buttholes are getting let off early because they are being good in the pen and go right back in for dumb shit. A distant friend of the family killed his children and his wife, then himself. Apparently, this is a classic family annihilator. The friend who went didn't quite know what happened, but went to the funeral. Everyone sat silently during a very generic and short service at the graveside, then left without saying a word. My grandmother followed my grandfather upstairs, yelling at him about something again. He pulls out a handgun, looks her in the eye, and says, "I'm sick of this crap." Bang. Open casket funeral. Nobody outside of his children and their children, grandkids, has any idea what really happened. All other relatives and friends think it was age. The one time I couldn't accept a death and bawled my eyes out throughout an entire service. Every time someone said God takes them when he wants them, I would start blubbering and have to walk away. There was this challenge where kids would drive from one town to the other in a certain amount of time. Something like 9 minutes when it's normally a 15+ minute drive. This meant you'd probably be doing 120 kph, around 75 mph, on this windy as frick road, in the dark and with kangaroos and wombats all over the place. I always thought it was an urban legend kind of thing. Like there was no way people actually did that, especially a lot of them drunk. Inevitably, there was a huge car wreck one night. They were all very intoxicated, including the driver, and they went into a tree. Driver was killed on impact. The girl in the seat behind her lost her legs and became quadriplegic, and luckily the people in the other 2 seats walked away with relatively minor injuries. It was a huge deal. It even made a national current affairs show where the mother of the girl who lost her legs trash talked the girl who was driving, saying it was all her fault, even though they all willingly got into the car knowing what the driver's intentions were. The funeral for the girl driving was pretty wild. She was well known in the area, pretty popular, known and liked by a lot of people. She was only 17, from memory, so she was really young too. I don't think there was a dry eye in the entire church, and everyone was a bit torn between the poor girl lost her life so young for no reason and she was drunk and driving a car in a stupendously idiotic way, so it's expected, right? Crazy. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.